But without further ado, let me introduce our guest tonight. Bill McKibben is founder and senior advisor emeritus of 350.org. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change and has appeared in 24 languages. He's gone on to write many more books, and his work appears regularly in periodicals from The New Yorker to Rolling Stone. He serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College, as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he's won the Gandhi Peace Prize, as well as honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish Parliament. Foreign Policy named him to its inaugural list of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. He will be interviewing tonight Daniel Sherrell. He's an organizer born in 1990. He helped lead the campaign to pass landmark climate justice legislation in New York and is the recipient of a Fulbright grant in creative nonfiction. Tonight he'll be discussing his first book, Warmth. So welcome, Daniel and Bill.
Well, let me just say a couple of words at the start here before we turn everything over to Dan, who's the reason we're here. What a pleasure to get a chance to interview him. This is a crackerjack book, really important. And obviously defines timely. It's as if the summer of 2021 had been programmed to as the kind of introduction to this book, between the insane weather that we're seeing around the world and the IPCC report and all the other signs of what's coming. And of course, people there in Point Reyes know this as well as any other people on the planet. It's always a pleasure to get to be even virtually in that part of the world, to think about the Mesa Refuge and Peter Barnes, to think about my old and dear friend Jonathan Rowe and his legacy there, and just what a remarkable community it is and what it means. And it's, that's why this book fits so perfectly with this place in this discussion, because it's really about how we're going to figure out how we live on a world that isn't necessarily quite the world we want to be. Dan, many, many thanks for your work. This is a remarkable book, and I hope you'll tell us the story of how it came to be and then read some from it, because your prose is remarkable.
Thanks so much, Bill, for that really generous intro. And I just want to say, obviously, it's an honor to be here with Bill. He's sort of a climate movement grandfather to me. And I think the reason that a lot of people in my generation found a way to get involved in this work and found a mirror in which we saw reflected our own values and our own fear and our own determination. So if you've read the book or if you want to read the book, Bill features prominently and heroically in the second chapter. So I encourage you to at least get that far. I started writing this book in 2018 when I'd been sort of in the trenches of the youth climate movement for about 7 or 8 years. And by in the trenches, I mean, I was in my email inbox, I was on conference calls, I was running between direct actions and lobby visits. And in all of that work, I could kind of always feel progressively over the years this knot of thought and emotion winding itself up in my chest about the immense emotional and metaphysical weight of this problem that I was ostensibly trying to deal with every day. And most of that time, that knot just stayed there. It was sort of an abstracted thing. I knew it was there. I didn't look too closely. I kept sending my emails. And then every now and again, and I mean every 6 months maybe, there'd be a morning where I'd wake up and the weight of what was happening would hit me, and then I wouldn't be able to get out of bed. And I came to be very interested in those moments of what felt to me like lucidity, because those felt like the only times when I was feeling something, the gravity of which was commensurate to the problem that I was working on. And I sort of intuited that unless I figured out a way to open up those moments and peer inside them, and to grapple with the thing they contained, that at some point something was going to break and I wouldn't be able to do this work for the rest of my life, which is my plan. So I didn't set out to write a book. I set out to read one. Literature is really one of the ways I process the world and my place in it. And I went looking for a book. There's a lot of amazing climate fiction, cli-fi as it's called. Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the leaders in that genre, but there are many others, Octavia Butler arguably, where the climate crisis is sort of displaced into the future as a sort of dystopian plot element. And what I felt like I needed was a thing that could contend with not the climate crisis as a fictional thing out in the future, but like, what did it feel like in 2021 to live with this weight of the weight of this thing that is going to continue fundamentally shaping all of our lives for the next century, and probably the lives of many generations hence. And I didn't really find that book. I found an amazing book by the writer Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement, which sort of theorizes the lack of that book. But so I started writing. I did not intend to write a book. I was like, on my way to work. I was working at the time for a big climate, labor, environmental justice coalition in New York. And I would just like tap out basically what were diary entries on the subway to work every day in just like the notes section of my iPhone. And over time, I started like addressing those notes to somebody. I felt like I needed an interlocutor to talk about this stuff, and I wasn't finding the cultural avenues to speak vulnerably about the weight of the climate crisis. Even with other people in the movement, it was often hard to really get into it because the thing felt so overwhelming and abstract at the same time. And the more I wrote to this imagined person, the more I realized that I, sort of without even realizing it, I was beginning to write to like my own hypothetical child, and the one that I wasn't sure that I was going to have. And then it kind of came to take on a more practical cast. I mean, I realized, I think, in this process that I had for a long time sort of subconsciously been excited about the prospect of being a father and having a family. And that also I felt deeply ambivalent about that choice, given what I knew about the scientific projections for the next 100 years. And that if I was ever going to justify bringing someone new into this world, then I had to, in a very practical way, be ready to like hand them an actual document that would start a conversation between us about the very difficult world they'd been brought into without their consent. And that if I couldn't write a document like that placed us in like honest and vulnerable conversation, but that wasn't nihilistic or fatalistic, if I couldn't do that, then I couldn't justify starting a family. So I set about that project, and it's been an immensely important sort of autotherapeutic thing for me, as a young person in the Anthropocene, and I think counterintuitively, it's helped me feel grappling with the full weight of the climate crisis, or at least trying to asymptotically, has made me feel more prepared for the next century, and not less. And rather than hovering all the time abstractly behind my head as a thing to fear but not fully understand, I've tried to like sit with the weight of it and incorporate it into how I move through the world. And writing this book was part of that process. So I'm going to read, hopefully, I don't know how long things take to read, but I think this will be short. It's like 4 pages. I'm going to read a section from about the middle of the book, where I describe a sit-in outside the office of a certain governor of New York who is currently going down in political flames, much to my satisfaction. The book is many things, and in fact, there's a lot of climate organizing and activism woven through it, but there's a lot that isn't that also. So at the risk of giving the sense that this book is strictly an activist memoir, which I hope it is, it's much more than that. I'm going to read this scene about being a young person trying to intervene in systems of power that feel like they're beyond your control. And so the section starts just as we've sat down outside the doors to his office in the Capitol in Albany. As soon as we sit, it is like an invisible button has been pressed on the marble floor, and a series of interlocking systems spring to life around the building. More security guards show up, rushing down the hall, then the first press photographers, then the Capitol Police, perfectly calm in their gray slacks and knit purple ties. The corridor is shut down to the public, though curious staffers crane their necks past the circle of guards, trying to catch a glimpse of the commotion. In the middle of the growing scrum, we unfurl our banner. It tells the governor exactly what bill to pass. It doesn't rhyme or mince words. The press will, we know, look for any opportunity to paint us naive. Demonstrators, they might call us, or even worse, young enviros. So we never risk being cute. The emphasis has to be on discipline. Point the banner at the camera, chant without flinching, stick to the talking points. The governor's not even in his office today, but our hope was never to speak with him directly. We know that if we get through to him at all, it will only be secondhand, through reporters and advisors, the whole bulwark of surrogates meant to shield him from our resolve. One by one, we get up to speak, talking honestly about our fear, demanding that the governor take action commensurate to the scale of the problem. The shutters on the cameras click. The police shift from foot to foot, hands clasped by their waists. One or two of us tear up, and the tears are real, embarrassing, though we will them not to be. But still, it feels like we are staging a play, something we've rehearsed at length and are now acting out for an audience of reporters and security personnel. In a basic sense, this is true. We've produced the sit-in specifically for the benefit of the press, hopeful that the syndicated image of dozens of young people pleading for their future outside the door of the governor's office will by necessity provoke some response from him, thrusting the debate into the public eye and winning us some leverage. But it is also true on a deeper level. In organizing daily against the problem, we've become so adept at compartmentalization that these actions are often our only chance to really grieve. The sit-in creates a context for it, a moment of heightened drama into which we can finally pour our anger and our disbelief and, scariest of all because we guard it so closely, our flickering but still unextinguished sense of hope. For this, we are our own audience. We perform our feelings and then they become real enough to wash over us. Around our circle, the machinery of the Capitol reacts, and we are satisfied to watch it scramble. We have sharpened catharsis to a point, punctured at least for a moment, the bubble of numbness that otherwise shrouds everything, all the time. Inside this bubble, the news anchors can devote more time to the British royal family than to the threat of rising sea levels. The governor can react with greater urgency to a small-time prison break than to the dire warnings being issued by the United Nations. And people in bars can still nod at us politely when we tell them, with equal parts pride and reluctance, what it is we do for work. We're reminded constantly that while we think and plan and worry about the problem nearly every day, the majority of people still almost never do. Being inside the bubble can make us feel crazy this way and lonely, like we are trapped in one of those classic nightmares, a monster closing in and everyone around us gone deaf. Yet to a certain extent, we live in the bubble too, anesthetized by email, focused on whatever the next task is, the next meeting. The drama is by far the exception. Most of our work has us sitting in front of our laptops or scribbling notes on butcher paper or printing out spreadsheets and attaching them to clipboards. It is often desensitizing, in other words, and this lends the work a surreal aspect, because with every control shift and reply all, we are supposedly trying to contain a vast and growing problem in the atmosphere itself, like our keyboards are somehow linked up with the sky. This mundanity is to an extent unavoidable. Despite the sanitized stories we've been fed on Martin Luther King Day, the way the man himself has been whitewashed with an especially sapless brand of heroism, we know enough by now to realize that social movements do not spring up out of nowhere, that it took dozens of organizers months of careful planning to pull off the freedom rides and the March on Washington. Still, the enormous experiential gap between the texture of our daily work and the violence of the problem it seeks to address can feel numbing, like we are wading through a dream. Direct action bridges this gap, allowing us for a moment to feel the emotional immediacy the problem deserves, to see it reflected in security cordons and the lenses of cameras. After about half an hour, the police begin arresting us. The official charge is disorderly conduct. One at a time, they motion for us to stand and strap plastic handcuffs around our wrists. Then they take us by the arm and walk us down to a converted conference space in the basement of the Capitol, where we sit in folding chairs waiting to be processed. The whole procedure is polite and pro forma. On the way down, each of us has to have our picture taken with our arresting officer next to a bank of metal detectors. This feels just like prom, someone says, and everyone in the room laughs. Eventually, we are released with a summons for a court date the following month. The action has worked more or less as we intended. We've garnered enough press to get a rise out of the governor, and will soon parlay this into a meeting with his chief of staff. But by the time I sit down in the van for the ride home, the thrill has largely worn off. I feel tired, hunched in my seat by the window. Unfolding my laptop, I squint into its clamshell glow. For a moment, I'm surprised by my empty inbox, and then I remember I have no Wi-Fi. I take out my phone and turn on the mobile hotspot. The screen seems to pause a beat, and then the messages arrive, a block of bolded subjects running down past the bottom of the screen, typical for a day spent off of email. There are messages from reporters and volunteers and directors of this and that, some of them sent just to me, some to lists of thousands. I work through them mechanically, dispatching each with a sentence, maybe two, unclear on what I'm saying until my fingers are already producing the words as if in a fugue state, capitalization falling away, syntax blurring, the replies appearing on screen like I haven't written them at all, like they are being preferred to me by some barely cogent third party. After a while, I close the laptop, unaware of what I've written, unable to make myself care. We are already halfway back to the city. I spend the rest of the drive with my cheek pressed to the leatherette of the sill, watching the pavement replenish itself frantically in the headlights. It never stops being strange that this is what I do now, that strategic breaches of the law are a part of my work, that I carpool to and from them in a van. As a child, I'd had other plans. At one point, I dreamed earnestly and absurdly of becoming a professional soccer player, still young enough to believe that careers arose naturally out of one's favorite grade school activity. Later, when my visions for the future sobered, I pictured myself as a landscape architect, raking beds of gravel into gently curving patterns, charting out pleasing constellations of trees. That was back when the world was a hidden premise, a smooth, hard plane. The future seemed to rise from it like a ramp, pointing upward at a manageable grade. All we had to do was walk up it in the direction of our choosing, and we'd come out better off, higher up, with a more expansive view over the terrain. But in the years it's taken us to age into the job market, something huge has shifted beneath our feet, a kind of temporal tectonics, a jolt of acceleration. Suddenly the world is changing faster than we are, its cycles spinning out of control. Geologic time, for eons a dull murmur behind the backdrop of history, has come crashing into the inviolate space we'd reserved for those myopic little snippets of eternity that we referred to as our lifetimes. In the course of a decade then, it's become vaguely absurd to build our future in the world like we would a house on some land, just erect it and trust it to stand. Increasingly, the only viable future seems to be in shoring up the future itself. And so the world transforms from a premise into a question, and we work desperately to answer it in our favor. The strangeness, though, comes from still being able to remember that prior world, the one in which nothing was going to change, in which it was still possible to treat the future as a linear projection of the present. The problem makes childhood seem very distant this way, a tiny scene at the end of a backward telescope, made of a different substance entirely than the halls of the Capitol, the plastic of the cuffs. Then again, maybe this isn't so strange. Just an update on that old loss of innocence, the latest expulsion from Eden. Just growing up, in other words.
So people now can see what I was saying when I said that this is remarkable prose. It's very smart, and it's also very powerfully written. And the point of that passage, I think, resonates incredibly powerfully with me. It manages to articulate something that I think a lot of us feel, which is that the thing that for all of human history existed as the more or less stable backdrop to the drama of human affairs, the stage set for the play, is sort of turning into the play itself, and coming very much to the backdrop as the foreground all of a sudden. And I think that that's one of the reasons probably that art and literature took a while to take up the climate question. You know, we understood for a very long time drama to be something about the conflicts between people over whatever it was, you know, war or marriage or all the other ways that people interact. And it's only lately that we've begun to understand that the fight in our lifetime, the conflict in our lifetime, is in powerful ways and unsettling ways different. I think maybe we began to realize that, you know, after the first atomic bomb was exploded, and probably there's people in the audience of a certain age who will resonate with what Dan's saying and think back to their own sense of a world made less stable, a world where you had to climb under your school desk and so on. But that terror faded, at least some, and this one just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. Dan, talk a little bit about the talk about the experience of publishing this book in this summer, when it feels like some of these truths are beginning to come home to a larger number of people, perhaps. Because one of the problems for a long time was that those of us who were worried about this felt like we were living in a nightmare, but you couldn't get anyone else to wake up to the nightmare, you know.
Yeah.
No one else could see the monster coming. But the monster's pretty visible now, especially for Californians. Do you find some comfort and solace in sharing that more widely, that sense of where we are?
Absolutely. But I think also in conversations I've had with people who haven't necessarily been in the nightmare with us and now are, because the wildfires at their back door and the floods are at their are washing through their towns. I think there's a real temptation when people get blindsided by that towards despair. And though this is not a blindly optimistic book, this is a stridently anti-fatalist book. In that, you know, a lot of the interviews I've done so far have focused around the latest IPCC report, which is basically a further confirmation, as if we needed one, that we're headed in a very, very dangerous direction. And I think the reaction sometimes is like, wow, I'm tuning into this. It seems like we're fucked already, you know? And that's, I think, to me, another form of compartmentalization. And I think my response to that IPCC report and the conversations I've had around this book in this week is actually, I've never felt more grounded in the moral stakes of what we have to do, because that report has made in no uncertain terms clear that for every 1/10 of a degree that we change the thermometer between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius, the former is very bad and think people continue to die in horrible disasters. The latter is like civilization becomes unraveled. We can't feed and hydrate everybody on this planet, and there are mass die-offs and migrations. For every 1/10 of a degree we move the thermometer towards the left end of that spectrum, we save or consign literally millions of lives. And so for me, it's really different than the threat of nuclear holocaust, which was a sort of binary issue, like the button is pressed or it's not. And here, I think the thing that is hard to wrap your head around is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. But the thing that we can't step away from is our ongoing ability to radically shape where on that swath of outcomes we land. And so part of what I hope to do with this book, and that I'm trying to do in the context of this horrible summer, where this nightmare we've been bracing for a long time feels like, holy shit, there's a headline every day, is just to like hold people in that space between blind hope and compartmentalization and despair. And to like, in that space is where we need to sit and hold each other and figure out how we're going to live together in the 21st century. And also to like tear people away from a mode of engagement with this problem, which is just like you're in your room by yourself on Twitter, doom scrolling through the horrible headlines. Like that is not that. I think that's a really spiritually thin posture through which to approach the coming century. And so I've been trying to use the book as a way to open up space for the kinds of vulnerable conversations that can like put us in a more resilient emotional community as we approach this century of upheaval. I shouldn't say approach, as we are currently amidst this century of upheaval. So yeah, I think it's been a dramatic time to release the book, and also I feel Donna Haraway, the theorist from UC Santa Cruz, who I love a lot, has this phrase. She always encourages people to stay with the trouble. You got to stay with the trouble. You can't move out in the direction of one direction or the other. So you got to hold it there. And I feel more than ever that call to stay with the trouble, to not turn away, and in that not turning away, to hold each other through it.
Let me interrupt the flow of thought here just for a minute to remind people that there's a button at the bottom of this screen that says buy the book, and you should buy the book. You should buy it because it's a really important book, a beautifully written one, and you'll want to read it and read it again in a few years. And you should also buy the book because local bookstores are an important thing. They've started to become, the ones that survived Barnes and Noble and Amazon have become important hubs of their communities. And so, friends don't let friends buy books on Amazon. This is a good opportunity to support an important institution in your community and to support a young writer at the beginning of an important career. It's one of the reasons it's important to buy books from writers that you like is because then they'll get the chance to write another one. And I have the strong feeling we're going to want to hear from Dan a lot in the years to come. So let's talk about the years to come. Dan, actuarially speaking, I'm not going to make it to mid-century, so I don't have to worry immensely about. I can kind of cross off on my mental list of things, sort of what the future looks like. Not entirely, because I have a daughter, but I can immerse myself more in the battles of the moment, just knowing that my moments are limited. When you think about good outcomes for the middle of the century, and I don't mean good outcomes in terms of what the temperature is going to be, I mean good outcomes in terms of what the community and the country and the world look like, what does that feel like to you?
I mean, I think the thing that I feel, I don't think lucky is the right word, But sometimes I wake up and I start my day in the climate movement, and I'm like, my God, I just cannot believe I'm involved in something of such moral and spiritual significance. Like, what better way to spend one's life? And I think the climate crisis is a crisis that puts many vulnerable people at risk. It is also a crucible through which we can create the world that we deserve, and a world that finally sees everybody with dignity. And by everybody, I mean all people, and also non-human people. My most recent job before the one I'm currently organizing national labor unions to really put meat on the bones of some of President Biden's climate jobs rhetoric. Before that, I was with an organization called the Green New Deal Network. And to me, on a policy level, the Green New Deal really typifies the world I want to live in, where not only are we passing the policies that are going to turn down the thermometer, but we're passing the sort of social democratic policies that actually make people resilient to crisis. And people are resilient to crisis when they have savings, when they have a stable job, when they feel like they can live a dignified life in a community surrounded by people that they love. And that's sort of, I think we've treated that for too long as a luxury. Like that's, we'll get to that at the end of capitalism once we've made our profit margins. But in fact, what the climate crisis is proving is that is non-negotiable, that if we want to hold the social fabric together, we have to treat everybody with dignity, and that nobody is an externality. And that externalities were always a fiction of neoliberal economics. And we shunted all the most important stuff to the peripheries of our worldview. And now we're getting screwed because of it. We blinded ourselves to the most important things. And when I say the most important things, I think the world that I want to live in also looks, I hesitate to use this word, but I think it looks philosophically different. In that I think that coming of age, like in the 90s, in Fukuyama's end of history, everything was stable. We were all individual consumers under late capitalism, and it would continue on that way ad infinitum. That trained our attention in a very limited scope on the people immediately around us, our own economic fortunes, and the remainder of our lifetimes. And I think what the climate crisis is showing us is that we cannot afford to be that myopic, that we are deeply interlinked with people all the way across the world, in Bangladesh and Tuvalu, in Oregon with the wildfires. Like, our actions and their actions are deeply interdependent. But we are also deeply interdependent with the non-human world. Like when a polar bears are a cliche of the climate movement at this point. When a polar bear is dying on an ice floe, that is not like, the posture towards that shouldn't be like, that sucks. Like, humans are so bad, we killed that polar bear. That's really regrettable. The posture should be like, that's the canary in our coal mine. And we are in fact fundamentally linked to that polar bear. And with it and everything it represents, we ourselves can't survive. And then also, the climate crisis makes us think way out past the boundaries of our own lifetimes. And I think it's that expansion of attention, which I think is going to take work, and like a shift in cultural norms, but also just like a shift in cognitive practices. That is the world I want desperately to live in. And there's an amazing anthropologist named Anna Tsing, who is a total genius. People should read her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, which is much less niche and more genius than that title would suggest. But she makes a strong case for what she calls resurrecting the arts of attention. And I think we've been paying attention for a very long time to all the wrong things, and training our attention to a wider lens is, I think, maybe going to be the most important. That will be the most important payoff in terms of beauty that I think we will get by taking on the climate crisis. I think we will live more beautiful lives, and less shallow and less desperate lives, if we learn how to live on this planet in a way that is just and sustainable. Like, I don't think there are only material gains to be had there, and I think the material gains are manifold, but I do think that like actually human cognition itself and what it feels like to be inside our own heads will be invested with a greater meaning if we learn to like take off these blinders we've set for ourselves and that are in some ways the cause of the predicament we're in.
I think that's a very wise answer. I want to underscore what you were saying at the beginning of it, because I think the other thing we've lived through in this past 18 months, the pandemic, has underscored that same point about maybe the way I'd phrase it is kind of hyper-individualism versus solidarity. You know, the world you were born into was the world that had been shaped above all by Ronald Reagan and by the revolution in American history that turned its back on common joint effort and announced that the important unit of all consideration was the single individual, that government, which is just another way of saying all of us working together, was the problem, and so on and so forth. Reagan's famous laugh line in all his speeches for years was the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Ha ha ha. I mean, now that we've determined that the scariest words in the English language are, "You've run out of ventilators," or "the hillside behind your house has caught on fire," maybe we're at a point where we can begin to escape that. And in fact, I mean, if you ask me, with all the weaknesses and all the compromises and things, the Biden era, in a certain way, is a real concerted effort to return to some, return or advance to some place where we think a little differently about who we are in relation to each other and what we owe each other. And I think that's the great political drama of our time in this country, especially a country that's always been on the dangerous edge of hyper-individualism, but at its best pulled back from it and figured out how to work as a society. And so I think that the climate crisis makes it very clear that there's no way around that. That the hellscape vision is all of us can imagine now. What it would be like to be holed up in your own house with your AK-47 guarding your last bag of flour or whatever it is. And not so impossibly far off anymore that we can ignore it or pretend it's not a possibility. And that's the moment when we may really reach for other possibilities. That's good. And if we do, it'll be books like yours that have played a role in organizing like yours. Because, of course, organizing is a way of incarnating some of the community that we want. It's a kind of odd temporary community sometimes of people coming together in a fight or a cause, but quite a beautiful one too, and one that can offer real meaning. What do you? We've talked about the long term, but what do you think is important for people to be imagining and doing in the next few years? What are the things that are really capturing your imagination and attention and effort?
Yeah, I would be remiss because I'm an organizer first and foremost. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention.
That's why I took you up. Yeah,
I know. I love that, and this is important. We are on the cusp in the next 2 to 3 months of passing what will be, by probably an order of magnitude, the most important climate legislation this country has ever passed, and that is the reconciliation bill that is currently on a knife's edge in the U.S. Congress. And if passed, this would be, $3.5 trillion if Kirsten Sinema doesn't, in her psychopathy, bring that number down for no reason. But anyway, this is a giant package of money, and it would finally, it's still not adequate, but it would take a massive first step in actually spending, like making government investments in the transition to renewable energy and making sure that transition is a just one, that finally does right by the communities who've been bearing the brunt of our previous energy economy, in the form of asthma and lung cancer and storm surges. They've been bearing that brunt for decades. And it's kind of like weird and wonky. Like people hear infrastructure reconciliation, there's like a two-step process, like everything. It's very, I mean, as usual, the Democrats are doing a horrible job messaging it. And they're just like, the Republicans are like, this is socialism. And the Democrats counter is like, this isn't socialism. Horrible messaging. You never want to box them in their frame. You want to create your own frame. But anyway, for folks who aren't tuned into that, that is truly a consequential piece of legislation and could really reorder life in this country and would be akin to some of the pieces of legislation passed in the original New Deal, which brought the United States out of the Depression and created like a stable middle class in this country for the first time. And like we could really win that. We could really, really win that. So there are going to be actions happening all over the country this August, pressuring members of Congress not to back down on that 3.5 trillion number and to hold the Democratic caucus together so we can get that across the finish line. And we really have basically no wiggle room. Our majorities in both houses are incredibly thin. So if you are doing anything with your summer on climate, it is going to, you can go to 350.org, you can go to greennewdealnetwork.org, and sign up for one of these actions that are making sure Congress knows we need to get this thing passed. Because that's the floor, not the ceiling. But if you want to build a house, you got to start with the floor. And this would be a pretty strong floor, I think. That's what I'm paying attention to. But I'd shoot the question back to you, Bill. I mean, Bill, Bill's leading the charge here, and he's still a mentor and advisor to so many people in the climate movement. So, what are you kind of looking at?
Well, first of all, just the same. I was on the phone with my senator from Vermont here not long ago, earlier today, just talking about some of this stuff, and it's the culmination of a lot of important things, and the process is incredibly messy, and who knows exactly how it's going to go. And it's now that Joe Manchin has assumed the role of prime minister in America, it's everything's a little harder than should be and all that, but I have great faith in Bernie and a lot of others to see us through. And I do think everybody needs to pile in and be heard and just let people know that this is a moment of great hope. I've spent much of my time. I mean, there are two levers in our world big enough to make a difference if we pull them. One of them is the political lever, and the other is the financial lever. And so I spend a lot of time working on taking on Wall Street and whatever. The huge divestment campaign that we've built over the years is now morphing into really significant pressure on banks and asset managers and insurance companies. People can join in that stop the money pipeline. And one of the things that I'm beginning to do, actually, Dan, is try to figure out, and we'll be sort of announcing more in the next few weeks, but I actually think it's time. The youth have done an excellent job of getting their act together and getting organized, and I was happy to play a little role in that when we started 350 with myself and 7 college students, a kind of first iteration of this work. But it's time for old people to get our act together. Fair or not, and not particularly fair, we ended up with a great deal of the money in this society, and we all vote. So our ability to make change is large too, and so we're going to be trying to do some serious organizing in that way as a kind of backup to an answer to the call that's come out so profoundly from young people over the last few years. And so I think it's an interesting, powerful moment it's a scary one because the physical momentum of the changes that we're seeing on the planet is large, and that's out of our control in a lot of ways. And things are not, we're not catching any breaks from physics ever. But it doesn't excuse us in any way from doing the work that we need to be doing. And in the course of that work, as my dearest friend in all these endeavors, Naomi Klein, keeps pointing out, that's in the course of it, that's how we build the world that we need to build. And so many, many, many thanks for the work that you do every day. I just want people to understand how powerful it's been. That big spending bill, if it gets passed, is directing 40% of its money towards vulnerable communities around this country, and that's a direct result of the work that people did organizing around the Green New Deal, that the Sunrise Movement and everybody else did to bring that home. And that will be absolutely the opposite of every other piece of legislation that we've ever passed in this country, which has reserved all its benefits for the people who needed them least, but who had the most political power. So it's suspend your cynicism and your nihilism for a few months, and do your Jimmy Stewart thing, everybody, for a little while, and let's get this thing through, drag it through the Senate, and that'll be a necessary jumpstart to a lot of the work that needs doing. We've got a few questions that people have put in, and I'm going to pose them to you, Dan, in my role as MC here. Both of them are coming from Susan Lippman, so let me ask the second one first. And it's an interesting one. We live in a time of instant gratification. How do we get human beings to understand the long-term commitment that's necessary to address the climate crisis? It's actually a very interesting question and those of us who feel like our minds have been addled by Twitter and things at this point have a deep sense of what she's talking about, I think.
Totally. That's exactly where my mind went on that question, was Twitter. I'm a conscientious objector from Twitter, but applaud those who are in the trenches every day, like Bill. But I do think that the rise of social media technology in the 21st century has come at a very bad time, especially for my generation and the generation below me, because as the physical world around us begins to disintegrate and unravel, the virtual world in our palms is blooming and tempting and at times all-consuming. And so how do we avoid a retreat from the former to the latter? And I think about that in two ways. First, on the policy level, because I always like talking policy with Bill, I think we need to regulate these companies into the ground. They have designed their technologies to be addictive, to give us little packages of dopamine every time we use them. That dopamine is the carrot they use to sell us to the advertisers who pay their bills. And it's a very inhuman system. And we're all kind of rats on their wheel. And there are ways to break up these tech companies and break up their monopolies, and also to regulate them, to make them less, to have them take less advantage of the particular psychological tics of humans that are a social species. And I think we absolutely need to do that. And there's actually, it's the rare issue where there's some bipartisan wiggle room, because everyone hates Facebook. But on a more spiritual level, I think a lot of people are turning to short-term gratification when they don't feel like they have avenues in their communities to process what's happening around them. And I think we haven't done a good job, especially around the climate crisis, of building cultural places where you can take the fear and the confusion and the overwhelm that you maybe feel in the peripheries of your mind, where you can take those and air them with others, and hold them together. And I think doing that cultural work and writing this book was a small part of trying to do that. But building the sort of communal places that people can go that are more nourishing than Twitter is really important, and not giving up on those spaces. The pandemic has been really hard in this way because it's forced us all back into our little cubby holes, our digital cubby holes. And I'm hopeful that when it becomes possible again, there will be a rekindling of our romance with the physical realm, coinciding with a regulation of the tech companies that sort of just diffuses how pernicious this cycle is between the horror of the world around us and the sort of red herring allure of our Twitter feeds. Because I think our Twitter feeds, while a good source of information, are not a good source of spiritual sustenance. So, but yeah,
that's
it's a tough question.
I want to just interrupt the dialogue. Since I've been watching the chat here, I just want it noted in passing that Rebecca Solnit, who I did not know was with us, has just announced that she'd ordered, if America's finest essayist, and that's what Rebecca Solnit is, has done this, then the rest of you should follow suit. And I got to say, throughout our conversation tonight, I've been thinking about Rebecca's amazing book, Paradise Built in Hell, about the way that communities rally in the face of disaster, and what that means, and what hope it is, what hope it provides us. I think it's the most hopeful book of the last decade, and deeply, profoundly connected to the issues that you're raising tonight. But I will just also say, it's hard to imagine a greater honor for someone on book tour than to have Rebecca Solnit drop in and order a book. Sorry to out you there, friend, but I could not resist. So the other question, well, let me just see if make sure I can say it right here. Camila Bustos asks, you talked a bit about the role of hope and optimism in navigating the crisis. What about the role of anger, which I think is a fair question, and it goes with something sort of that Susan Whitman was saying. Daniel said he can wake up and marvel in the worthiness of the endeavors of the movement fight. Could we not turn that around and say that we have the world that we have earned? That's a slightly bleak view, but the question about the way to think about it in terms of anger really strikes me as important. I confess I'm a bad person in that way. There are days when I wake up and feel a certain amount of despair, and it's the thing that gets me going through the day is just seeing if thinking about how much I hate Exxon, and maybe I can cause them some more trouble in the course of the afternoon. But what do you? How do you think about anger because it is a tool for organizing too, along with all the beautiful things we've been talking about tonight.
Yeah. I think I wouldn't use the word anger. I'd use the word rage. It really feels like rage inside of me. I have a lot of it. In the book, I described going to a meditation retreat at some point where you're essentially sitting with your own thoughts, sitting inside your head for 10 days. And I was almost embarrassed to realize how much of my baseline cognitive space was just writing screeds against Mitch McConnell. That was actually happening in my head, kind of at a low frequency at a lot of the time. And my God, is it justified? Along with my rage often comes confusion, because I like most of the people that I meet. And I feel like I've never met somebody who seems capable of making the kinds of sociopathic decisions these men make every day, to prioritize their marginal profits over the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. It's really an unfathomable decision to me, and one that is still sort of mysterious. I kind of suspect that we've created corporate and political structures that self-select for sociopaths. I actually think that that's maybe a problem that we have to address. But the place where I ultimately take that is, I think there's this whole debate around like, is anger useful in the movement, and is it justified? And I think I would answer yes to both of those things. But I'd also say that for me, at least, it can't be the ultimate bedrock, because, and that's not really a moral point, it's more of a strategic point. The things that we are angry against, like the Donald Trumps of the world, the Scott Pruitts of the world, the Exxon Mobils of the world, like, they are going to lose, at least in the sense that, like, the system that they built and are protecting with all their money has self-destruction at its very core. Like, at its very core, the system that they have built is eating itself. And so at a certain point, that's going to fall away. And if all we have is our anger to drive us forward, we won't know where to go. And I think it's a cliche, but I think I try as a practice to ground my participation in the climate movement in not anger at the enemies I'm trying to defeat, but love for the things that I'm trying to protect and stand in solidarity with. And I think in my better days, and I'm not saying all days are my better days, but in my better days, that love feels like it has a much longer horizon than my rage. And so I try to train my eyes on that horizon. Not to embarrass her further, but Rebecca Solnit's writing has been a deep inspiration to me, and I think grounds in a lot of that work. And also, she has a fantastic book of maps of New York called Nonstop Metropolis that I read literally I peruse literally every morning over breakfast. So this is totally embarrassing, and I'm sorry, Rebecca, we've never met, but thank you for some of your writing that's inspired mine.
That was a beautiful, wise answer, and you're a better man than I, and I'm grateful for it, and extraordinarily grateful for this book and for your work. We've reached the end of the hour, and I think people have done what they're supposed to do and buy the book, but I think also people have, I hope, done what they need to do and figure out how it is they can enmesh themselves in this work if they're not already. So many, many thanks to Point Reyes Books, to all the people in Point Reyes and environs, but mostly many, many thanks to Dan. It's a great honor to get to greet you at the start of a really important life and career.
Likewise, Bill. Thank you so much. And because we're both organizers at heart, there is the link where people can sign up for Seal the Deal actions this August. Literally, this is how we're going to get the reconciliation bill passed, which will be the biggest step forward we've ever taken as a country on climate. And if there's even more important than buying my book, which is of the utmost importance, is showing up to one of these actions and standing in solidarity with the people you love as you try to, fight for the world that we all want to live in. So appreciate you being here, but we'll even more appreciate you being there. Thanks to Bill, and thanks to Point Reyes.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Bill, so much for such a fascinating conversation. If anyone wants to rewatch this or share it, it'll be available on the Crowdcast page immediately after this, and we'll get it up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. And thank you all so much, and have a great night.
Thanks all.
Take care.